Here is the question The Walking Dead has been asking since the very first episode, and it never stops asking it. What would you become? Not what would you do? What would you become? Because there's a difference. Rick Grimes had an answer at the beginning. He'd become the same thing he always was. A good man, a fair man, a man who followed rules even when the rules made things harder. Shane Walsh had a different answer. He'd become whatever he needed to be. He'd turn off the switch that made him feel guilty, and he'd do what had to be done. And the great slow tragedy of this entire universe is watching every character who starts with Rick's answer gradually arrive at Shane's. Not because they wanted to, not because they were evil, but because the world they were living in demanded it, and they loved the people around them too much to say no. So let's go through them, one by one. Let's watch it happen. Let's begin with something the show tells you in its title, and then spends 11 seasons proving. The Walking Dead. That phrase, if you take it at face value, refers to the undead, the walkers, the shuffling, groaning hordes that fill the background of every scene. But Robert Kirkman, the man who created this universe as a comic book in 2003, was very deliberate about what those words actually mean. He didn't name it after the zombies, he named it after the survivors. The Walking Dead are the people still breathing, the people making hard choices in the dark, the people who used to have names and jobs and families and a sense of who they were, and who are now, episode by episode, being hollowed out by a world that punishes empathy and rewards ruthlessness. The title is not a description, it's a warning. And nowhere is that warning more clearly illustrated than in the show's leaders. Think about the structure of the story for a moment. Season after season, the writers introduce someone new. A new group, a new settlement, a new figure of authority. And every single time, without fail, that figure follows the same arc. They rise, they protect, they are tested, they compromise. They justify the compromise. They compromise again. And eventually, sometimes slowly, over the course of seasons and sometimes in a single stunning moment, they cross a line that makes them, by any fair moral measure, the villain of their own story. Shane Walsh gets there in season 2. The governor gets there before we even meet him. Negan has already arrived by the time he steps out of that RV in the season 6 finale. But the most important version of this arc, the one the show uses as its moral spine, the one it returns to again and again, belongs to the man we followed from the very beginning. Rick Grimes, the sheriff's deputy from King County, Georgia. The good man. And if even Rick couldn't hold the line, what does that tell us about the line? What does it tell us about the nature of leadership itself, when the law that once governed it has been removed? That is the question this video is going to sit with for the next hour or so. We're going to move through the Walking Dead universe's most significant leaders, one by one. We're going to take our time with each of them, their beginnings, their beliefs, their breaking points, because this story rewards patience. The best analysis of The Walking Dead isn't loud. It doesn't need to shout. It's quiet and slow and thorough, like the show itself at its best. So find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow down. Let the voice of this video wash over you like a slow tide. And let's begin. Chapter 2. The Pattern and the Philosophy. Before we get to specific characters, it's worth spending some time on the philosophical framework that holds all of this together. Because The Walking Dead is not just a survival story, it is, at its core, a thought experiment dressed in blood and leather jackets, and the experiment has a very specific hypothesis. The question the show's really asking is one of the oldest in political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes, writing in 1651 in a book called Leviathan, argued that without the structure of civilization, human life reverts to a state of nature that is, in his famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Without law, without a shared agreement about what is and isn't permitted, people would be in permanent competition for resources, for safety, for survival. There would be no trust, no cooperation, no future, only the present and its demands. The only escape from this state, Hobbes argued, was to surrender individual freedom to a sovereign power, someone strong enough to enforce order. You give up some of your liberty. You receive protection in return. That is the social contract. That is civilization. The Walking Dead is Leviathan played out on screen. Over 11 seasons and multiple spin-offs. Remove civilization. Remove law. Remove the social contract. Watch what happens to the people who are strong enough, or stubborn enough, or desperate enough to try to rebuild it. What happens is always the same. The sovereign becomes the tyrant. This happens for a very specific reason, and it's a reason the show understands at a deep level. The qualities that allow someone to lead in a crisis: decisiveness, ruthlessness, a willingness to sacrifice individuals for the group, an ability to act without hesitation when hesitation costs lives, are the same qualities that define authoritarianism. There is no clean distinction between them. Executing a prisoner to protect your community and executing a dissident to protect your power look identical from the outside. The only difference is the internal justification. And internal justifications are extraordinarily easy to manufacture when the stakes are survival. Every leader in The Walking Dead runs this calculation, consciously or not. Every one of them finds a reason, usually a genuinely good reason, early on, to cross a moral line, and every one of them finds that the line once crossed is easier to cross again, and again, until one day they look back and cannot find the line at all. It has dissolved somewhere behind them, in the long accumulation of necessary choices. Shane called it the switch. Turn it off, stop feeling guilty, stop measuring what you're doing against a world that no longer exists. Survive. Rick called it something different at different points in his journey. Justice, protection, mercy, the right thing. He dressed it in the language of the old world for as long as he could. The governor never called it anything. He simply did it and kept fish tanks as trophies. Negan called it math. People are a resource. Resources need to be managed. Management requires enforcement. Simple math. Alpha called it nature. The world always was this way. Civilization was the lie we told ourselves. Pamela Milton called it governance. Different words. The same destination. Chapter 3. The ground rule. It starts with love. Here is the thing that unites every single one of these leaders, and it is the thing that makes their stories tragic rather than simply dark. They all started out trying to protect someone they loved. This sounds obvious, but sit with it for a moment, because it changes everything. Shane Walsh didn't become a ruthless survivor because he was inherently cruel or because the apocalypse flipped some hidden switch in his brain. He became a ruthless survivor because he loved Laurie and Carl with everything he had, and the idea of losing them was the one thing he could not survive. The governor didn't become a monster because power corrupted a blank slate. He became a monster because he loved his daughter Penny, and he could not accept the reality of what had happened to her. He was still grieving, still locked in the moment of her loss, and everything he did, every act of violence, every territorial war, every severed head in a tank, was the outward expression of a man who refused to let go. Negan, the man who made a barbed wire baseball bat his calling card, who built an empire on enforced submission, named that bat after his dying wife. He called her name out in the dark, over and over, long after she was gone. He could not put her down when she turned. He asked a passing stranger to do it for him. The bat was a monument. The bat was a gravestone. The bat was the love of his life, made into a weapon. Alpha gave up her name, her past, her humanity, every relationship she had ever had. And even then, at the very end, she could not kill her daughter. Carol, the woman who executes problems before breakfast, who shot a child in a field of flowers and burned 2 infected people alive, began the series as a victim who was afraid of her own shadow. Her entire transformation was an act of love, a refusal to let grief consume her without becoming something that could protect the people who remained. Love is the engine. Love is what makes the compromise feel worth it. Because when you love someone, and the stakes are their life, the moral arithmetic changes completely. What would have been obviously wrong in the old world becomes justifiable, even necessary, when the alternative is watching the person you love suffer or die. You crossed a line for them, and then you find that the line has moved, and you cross it again. The Walking Dead is a study in what love does to people when the stakes are absolute, and the answer it keeps arriving at, with the patience of a story that is taking its time and knows exactly where it is going, is this: love is the most powerful force in the post-apocalyptic world, and it is also, in the wrong conditions, the most reliable path to becoming a monster. With that established, let's meet the leaders. Chapter 4. Shane Walsh, the prophet nobody wanted to believe. Shane Walsh is the most tragically vindicated character in The Walking Dead. John Bernthal played him across the first 2 seasons with a coiled, desperate energy, a man who could see the truth about the new world before anyone else and was destroyed by being right too soon. In the beginning, Shane was a good leader by almost any objective measure. He was Rick Grimes' best friend and fellow deputy from King County. When the outbreak began and Rick was shot and put into a coma, Shane believed his friend was dead. The hospital had soldiers executing patients in the corridors, and there was no way out except fast. Shane got out. And when he did, he found Rick's wife Laurie and their son Carl, and he kept them alive. He organised the quarry camp outside Atlanta. He taught people how to filter water, how to clear a building, how to conserve ammunition. He maintained order in a group that had no framework for order. He was decisive, physically capable, and genuinely committed to the people in his care. The problem was that Shane could see, with terrible, exhausting clarity, what the new world actually required. And what it required was something that the old world would have called psychopathic, the ability to turn off the part of your brain that measured every action against the moral standards of a society that no longer existed, the ability to do what needed to be done without the crippling weight of guilt. His breaking point came in a dark high school gymnasium in Season 2 during an episode called Save the Last One. He and a man named Otis had broken into a building to retrieve medical supplies for Rick's son Carl, who had been shot accidentally and was bleeding out on a farm. They were surrounded by walkers in the corridors. Both of them were injured. Their ammunition was nearly gone, and both men were slower than they needed to be. Shane did the calculation. If both of them tried to reach the fence and escape, both of them would die. But if one of them created a distraction, a slow, loud, bleeding distraction, the other might reach the supplies and save Carl's life. Otis was a large man. He was slower. He would buy more time. Shane said he was sorry, and then he shot Otis in the leg. He stripped the supply bag from the screaming man's back while the walkers closed in around him. He heard Otis's voice as he ran, then heard it stop. He came home with the medicine. He stood at Otis's funeral and told a story about how brave Otis had been, how Otis had insisted Shane take the supplies, how Otis had died a hero. Later, Shane shaved his head, not from grief, to hide the patch of scalp where Otis had torn out a handful of hair during the struggle, the only evidence of what had actually happened in that corridor. The moral weight of the Otis moment is enormous, and the show is careful not to simplify it. Carl lived. Otis died. A child breathes because a man was sacrificed. How do you do the arithmetic on that? The show offers no clean answer, because there is no clean answer. And that deliberate ambiguity is exactly the point. What follows is Shane's rapid deterioration. He forced open Herschel's barn of walkers in the mid-season finale of Season 2, dragging one out by a rope and gunning it down in the yard, screaming at the assembled group that these things were not sick. They were not people. They were dead, and they needed to stop pretending otherwise before the pretending got them all killed. He was not wrong. He was just doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, driven by jealousy and desperation rather than genuine clarity. And the last walker to stumble out of that barn was Sophia, the missing girl everyone had been searching for weeks. Carol's daughter. She'd been in there the whole time. Herschel had known. Shane's deterioration extended to threats and intimidation, to cornering Laurie drunk and forcing himself on her. In a moment she physically had to fight him off, to staging the escape of a prisoner named Randall, as a pretext to lure Rick alone into a moonlit field and kill him. Rick recognised the trap. He walked into it anyway, eyes open, talking calmly about whether they could fix what had broken between them, getting close. And when he was close enough, drove a knife into Shane's chest. The series' deepest irony about Shane Walsh is that he was right. Not about Laurie, not about Rick needing to die, but about the world, about what survival required. Rick spent the next several seasons doing exactly what Shane had advocated, executing preemptively, acting without hesitation, building systems of control based on strength rather than consent. The man who killed Shane for being too ruthless eventually became something Shane would have recognised in a heartbeat. In Season 9, as Rick lay dying on a bridge with a metal rod through his stomach, he hallucinated Shane. And in the hallucination, Shane looked at what Rick had become and smiled. The show's verdict on its first villain is written in that smile. Shane was right. He was just wrong about who he loved, and that wrongness poisoned everything else. Chapter 5. Rick Grimes, The Long Fall of a Good Man. Rick Grimes' arc from sheriff's deputy to something harder and darker and more dangerous is the moral backbone of the entire series. Andrew Lincoln played him across 9 seasons as a man in constant internal war, between the lawman he was trained to be and the survivor the world forced him to become. And the tension between those two identities never fully resolves. That unresolution is the point. He woke up alone in a hospital surrounded by the dead, in a world he didn't recognise. His first acts in the apocalypse are almost aggressively symbolic. He finds a half-dead walker woman near the hospital, just a torso dragging herself across a park with her hands. And he gets off his bicycle, kneels beside her, and says he's sorry before putting her down. Not because she's a threat to him, because it seems like mercy. He finds a dead man's wallet on the road later and reads the driver's licence aloud to himself. Wayne Dunlap, born 1979, $28 in his pocket when he died. Rick mourns a stranger. He honours people who no longer need honouring. That is who he is at the beginning. For the first 2 seasons, Rick leads from a position of genuine moral clarity. He believes there are lines you simply don't cross. You don't kill the living. You don't abandon people because they're inconvenient. You make decisions together. He calls it democracy when addressing the group, and he means it. He is the sheriff not just in his old job title, but in his whole understanding of what authority means. Authority as service, as protection, as trust earned and constantly renewed. The Ricktatorship speech at the end of Season 2 ends all of that. After killing Shane in the moonlit field, after pulling the group together and revealing that Dr. Jenner at the CDC had told him months ago that everyone was already infected, that the bite didn't cause the turn, that the turn was already inside all of them waiting. When the group erupts in anger and betrayal at being kept in the dark, Rick breaks open entirely. He had killed his best friend for these people. He had done everything anyone could have asked. If anyone didn't like it, they could leave. But if they stayed, they needed to understand something. This isn't a democracy anymore. 14 words. And with them, the sheriff's deputy died and the authoritarian was born. The escalation over the seasons that follow is methodical and devastating. At the prison, Rick drives a machete into a prisoner's skull mid-conversation, calmly echoing the man's last dismissive words back to him. As he swings, and not in rage but in cold, calculated decision, this is not the Rick who mourned Wayne Dunlap. On the road during Season 4, when a gang called the Claimers corners Rick and his group in the dark, and one of them moves toward Carl, Rick headbutts the man restraining him, and when the man pins him again, Rick bites into his carotid artery and tears it out. Then he takes a knife and stabs Carl's attacker not once or twice, but over and over and over, far past the point of necessity. While Carl watches. When he's asked about it later, Rick says, "I know who I was before. I know who I am now." He says it like a man at peace with the answer. At Alexandria, Rick pulls a gun on the community at a public meeting, covered in blood, screaming in the middle of the street, "How many of you do I have to kill to save your lives?" The Alexandrians look at him with the same expression people once used for the governor. Michonne knocks him unconscious, because she knows what that face is. She has seen it before. The Season 8 finale represents both Rick's darkest moment and his partial redemption simultaneously. He calls Negan out to a final confrontation under a beautiful tree with morning light coming through the branches, and he makes a speech about Carl's vision for the future, a future where people who have been enemies can build something together. And while Negan is listening, genuinely listening, Rick slashes his throat with a broken glass shard. Then, before Negan can die, Rick is screaming for Siddiq to save him, sobbing under the tree, whispering his son's name. My mercy prevails over my wrath. Carl's words, Carl's dying wish, delivered in a letter, lived out in a moment of terrible grace. Without Carl, Rick Grimes would have become the governor. The show is honest about this. The people who loved him are what held the line, and when they were gone, when Laurie died in the prison, when Carl died from a walker bite, when the bridge blew up and Rick disappeared from his family's lives for 8 years, what remained was a man in CRM captivity, trying to find a reason to keep escaping. The Ones Who Live is about what happens when a man like Rick runs out of people to come home to. And the answer the show gives is that he almost doesn't survive it. Almost becomes something else entirely, in the grey concrete halls of a military installation that wants to use him, rather than know him. Michonne pulls him back. She's always pulling him back. That has always been what she is for. Chapter 6, The Governor, the portrait of nobody made powerful. Philip Blake, the Governor, is The Walking Dead's argument that the apocalypse doesn't create monsters. It removes the constraints that kept the monsters hidden. Before the world ended, Philip Blake was nobody in particular, a middle management office worker in a small Georgia city, mediocre and forgettable, and coasting. His wife had died in a car accident 18 months before the first walker appeared. His daughter Penny was the one thing in his life that gave him a reason to be in it. When the world collapsed, he discovered that he had a gift he'd never had occasion to use: the complete absence of a conscience worth mentioning, combined with a remarkable talent for projecting confidence and authority. In the old world, these qualities had gotten him nowhere. In the new world, they made him a king. Woodbury was his masterpiece. A fortified town of 73 survivors with electricity, walls, block parties, and a sense of normalcy so carefully constructed that people wept when they found it. There was order. There was a perimeter. There was a charismatic leader with an eye patch who projected certainty in every direction and killed threats before they became problems, and no one needed to ask too many questions about the details. The details were, of course, the problem. Behind a locked door in the governor's private apartment, dozens of fish tanks, each containing a preserved and faintly animated severed head. Walker heads and human heads both, trophies from people the governor had personally killed. When his researcher Milton asked why, the governor explained with perfect calm. He kept them so he would never forget. Because the act of ending a threat, the smell of gunpowder, the weight of finality, made you feel alive, made you feel like you had won. And the heads were the proof that you had won, for every day afterward when the doubt crept in. Also behind a locked door, Penny. His daughter. Reanimated, chained in a straitjacket, dressed in clean clothes, being brushed and spoken to and fed pieces of meat. The governor had hired a scientist specifically to research whether walkers retained memories. He had filled journals with tally marks counting the days since she turned. His love for Penny was the truest thing about him, and it was also completely, catastrophically deranged. When Michonne discovered Penny and put a katana through her head, what remained of Philip Blake shattered. Their fight through the apartment, knocking tanks off shelves, crawling through broken glass and preserved heads rolling across the floor, ended with Michonne driving a glass shard through his eye, his trophies literally blinding him. What followed was the show's most surprising subplot: the governor's attempted recovery. After massacring his own soldiers in a rage following the first failed prison assault, he wandered alone for months, hollow and filthy, barely distinguishable from the walkers he moved among. He found a family, a woman named Lily, her sister Tara, and young Megan, who had her father's same quiet way of looking at the world. He called himself Brian Herriot. He burned the photograph of his real family. He played chess with Megan, who drew an eye patch on the king piece and said it looked like him. He tried. By every available measure, he genuinely tried to stop being the person he was. He couldn't. The moment he encountered another community, another leader with another claim on authority, the old architecture reasserted itself. He bludgeoned a man with a golf club for suggesting shared leadership. He strangled another man who advocated patience. He assembled a new army and returned to the prison with a tank. He held Herschel on his knees with a blade to his neck, and Rick made a speech about how it wasn't too late, about how they had all done terrible things and could still come back from them, and Herschel smiled because he believed it. The governor paused, said, "Liar," and swung. The episode drew 12 million viewers. The image of Herschel, the show's moral compass, the man who had argued for mercy and coexistence more stubbornly and more consistently than anyone, being beheaded in a field became the show's defining statement about what happens to goodness in this world. It gets kneeled in a field and executed by a man in an eye patch who was nobody before the rules disappeared. That is the governor's legacy. Not the fish tanks, not Woodbury, just that field and that blade, and Herschel's smile disappearing in the morning light. Chapter 7. Negan, the gym teacher who named his bat after grief. Everything about Negan Smith is performance. The swagger, the profanity, the leather jacket, the terrifying good humour. The rules, loudly announced, specifically enumerated, absolutely enforced. The theatrical entrance from the RV, bat over his shoulder, a grin on his face while grown men kneel in the dirt. Every element of the Negan persona is constructed. A mask built from grief and leather and barbed wire. Underneath it all is one of the simplest and most devastating love stories the franchise ever told. Before the apocalypse, Negan was a high school gym teacher from a small town, foul-mouthed, reckless, beloved by some students and a nightmare for administrators. He was fired at some point for punching a parent. He blew money on a $600 leather jacket while his wife Lucille worked to support them. He was having an affair with a woman named Janine. By his own later admission, he was a terrible husband in almost every way that counted. Lucille was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She found out the same day she discovered the affair. She never confronted him about it. She simply absorbed both pieces of information and continued loving him, which is perhaps the most devastating detail in his entire backstory. When the outbreak began, Negan and Lucille sheltered in their basement. He turned himself into her caretaker. He learned to administer chemotherapy. They ate dog food when the supplies ran low. They watched DVDs by candlelight. For those weeks in the basement, running on fumes and terror and love, Negan was the husband he had never been before. Then he turned off the generator one night to avoid attracting walkers and fell asleep and forgot to restart it, and the refrigerated chemo drugs spoiled. He left to find more, and in the course of finding them, he made a decision that traded two strangers' lives for the medicine he needed. He came home with the drugs. He opened the basement door. On it, in Lucille's handwriting, "Please don't leave me like this." She had handcuffed herself to the bed, taken pills, tied a bag over her head. She had turned. She was still on the bed. Negan kissed her forehead and could not bring himself to put her down. He asked a teenager who happened to be outside to do it for him. Then he found the leather jacket Lucille had hidden in the floorboards. She had known about it all along, kept it for him anyway, pulled it on, wrapped a baseball bat in barbed wire, named it after the woman he had failed every day of their marriage until the very end, and set the house on fire as he walked away. He was not the governor in that moment, though he would become something equally dangerous. He was a man so consumed by guilt that he needed to build the entire world around the shape of his loss. The Saviours were the empire Negan constructed on that foundation. The Sanctuary, a converted factory, hundreds of members, multiple satellite communities paying tribute in food and medicine and supplies, a points-based economy, a hierarchy of lieutenants, an absolute code of conduct enforced through the iron, a piece of metal heated in fire and pressed against the face of anyone who broke the rules, leaving a scar that would be visible every day for the rest of their life. Dwight's face told that story. So did Mark's. The iron was not administered in anger. Negan was always calm when he held it. Calm was the point. His rules had internal logic that the show takes seriously. No rape. He executed a member of his own group for it personally, standing over the body while the community watched. No stealing, no acting without authorization. In exchange, safety, food, a structured existence in a world that had lost all structure. You work for me, you get to live. He called it simple math. And in the mathematics of the apocalypse, it wasn't entirely wrong. The lineup scene exists in a category almost entirely its own, in the history of television drama. The season 6 finale ended with Negan stepping out of an RV, Bat resting on his shoulder, 13 people kneeling in a clearing in the dark. He talked for several minutes, introducing himself, explaining the system, making absolutely clear what was about to happen and why. Then he played Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, walking the bat slowly along the line. Anybody moves, anybody says anything, cut the boy's other eye out and feed it to his father. The screen cut to black for 8 months. Abraham Ford died first. Skull destroyed. His last words were defiant to the end. Then Daryl moved, a reflexive punch in response to Negan taunting him after Abraham's death, and Negan pivoted to Glenn as punishment. Glenn's eye had shifted in his skull. He could barely form words. He turned toward his pregnant wife and said, "Maggie, I'll find you." Then the bat came down again, and again, and again. The episode drew over 17 million viewers, the largest audience in the show's history. What followed was an extraordinarily patient argument across multiple seasons that Negan was something other than pure evil, that behind the performance was a man still trying, in the most broken way imaginable, to do something that resembled good. His bond with young Carl Grimes, his voluntary return to his cell after escaping, his killing of Alpha, the new family he built in the years after the war, a wife named Annie, a son he named Negan Jr. but sent away because he believed his presence put them at risk. In Dead City Season 2, Maggie watches him play Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Moe with a new electrified bat against a new set of enemies, the exact geometry of her worst memory repeated, and she stands there because the situation demands it. She tells him afterward, "I will never forgive you, but I will try to find it in me to let it go." That line is the show's most honest statement about what justice looks like in a world this broken. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just the daily decision to let it sit without letting it consume you. Chapter 8. Alpha, the philosophy of nothing left to lose. Every leader in The Walking Dead eventually reaches the conclusion that the rules no longer apply to them. Alpha arrived having already made that decision. She didn't abandon the rules of civilization. She rejected the philosophical premise that those rules had ever meant anything at all. Her real name was Dee. She killed her own father at age 9, by her own admission without remorse. She survived years of domestic abuse, escaped with her young daughter Lydia, and eventually killed her entire shelter group, including her husband Frank, because they had become, in her assessment, too weak to survive. She encountered the Whisperers, an existing group already wearing walker skins and moving silently among the dead, murdered their leader, skinned the woman's face, and wore it as her own mask and seized control. The philosophy she enforced was radical in its consistency and terrifying in its internal logic. The old world had been a delusion. Its laws, its structures, its names and identities and relationships were a story humanity told itself to feel better about being animals. The walkers were not an aberration. They were nature's correction. Humanity's true form was the pack, the herd, the law of physical dominance stripped of its poetry. She told her followers, "We walk in darkness, we are free. We bathe in blood, we are free. We love nothing, we are free." The Whisperers had no names. They erased their pasts. They wore the skins of the dead and moved among walker herds, controlling them, redirecting them as weapons. They marked territories by roaming herds rather than fences. They operated on pure animal hierarchy. The strong led, the weak followed, or were abandoned. There was no democratic process, no appeal, no mercy. The Pike scene in Season 9's episode The Calm Before is the franchise's single most horrifying act of territorial communication. Alpha infiltrated the kingdom's trade fair disguised as a civilian, quietly identified and kidnapped community members throughout the day, and had them executed. 10 severed heads were placed on wooden pikes at the border of Whisperer territory, a message that required no translation. Among them, Enid, who had survived so much, Tara, the Hilltop's leader, Henry, who was Carol's adopted son, and who had been, the episode showed in flashback, falling in love with Lydia. The survivors who found the border stood in the field looking from face to face, and the silence of that scene is still, years later, almost unbearable to watch. Alpha's great weakness, the one crack that ran all the way through her philosophy, was Lydia. She had told everyone, including herself, that she would kill her daughter without hesitation if weakness demanded it. She had manipulated Lydia's memories so thoroughly that Lydia genuinely believed her father Frank was the abuser, that her mother had protected her. None of it was true, and when the moment came to kill her own child, Alpha could not. She told Beta Lydia was dead. She mourned her in private, in the dark, alone. Negan recognised this the first time he looked at her. He spent weeks building her trust and then used that exact vulnerability, the suggestion that Lydia might be found in an empty cabin, to lure her to her death. She walked through the door. He cut her throat. He is in that moment simply doing to Alpha what Alpha had done to Henry and Enid and Tara and all the rest. The cruelty of the circle is not lost on anyone. Alpha never found her way back. Beta retrieved her zombified head, pressed his forehead to hers, whispered to her, and incorporated a piece of her face into his own mask. He wore her into the final battle of the Whisperer War, howling her name, leading a herd of thousands. Even in death, she was still the architecture of someone else's destruction. She had built a world without love, and the man who loved her most could not let her go. Chapter 9. Carol, the quiet apocalypse of a woman. Everyone underestimated. Melissa McBride's Carol Pelletier undergoes the most radical character transformation in the series. She begins as an abused wife, meek, submissive, flinching, her hair cut short because her husband Ed would grab it when he was angry. She deferred to everyone and defined herself entirely by her relationships. Wife, mother, invisible woman. She took up as little space as possible because taking up space had always been punished. What the apocalypse revealed, not created, revealed, was that every skill Carol had developed to survive her marriage translated perfectly into survival in a world without rules, reading people before they acted, performing harmlessness, anticipating violence before it arrived, making herself invisible in plain sight. The tools of a domestic abuse survivor become, in the right environment, the tools of something much more dangerous than any of the men who had underestimated her. Sophia's death in Season 2's mid-season finale, the last walker to stumble out of Herschel's barn, is the girl everyone had spent weeks searching for, does not break Carol. It frees her in the most painful way imaginable. Every remaining attachment to the person she had been, every last thread connecting her to the woman who let people walk over her, is severed by the sound of that barn door. What follows is one of the most sustained and quietly devastating arcs the show produces. She preemptively kills 2 infected people at the prison to stop a flu outbreak and burns their bodies. And when Rick confronts her, she tells him simply that they would have drowned in their own blood. No apology, no defensiveness, just the logic. He banishes her. She survives alone and comes back harder. In a grove in Season 4, she walks a mentally unstable 12-year-old named Lizzie out into a field of flowers. Lizzie has just killed her sister Mika and was about to kill baby Judith because she believed the walkers were just different. Not dead, not dangerous, and she wanted to prove it. Carol holds Lizzie's hand and says very gently, "Just look at the flowers, Lizzie. Just look at the flowers." Then she shoots the child in the back of the head. The episode title is The Grove. It is widely considered one of the best single episodes in the show's run, and one of the most devastating pieces of television in the prestige drama era. At Alexandria in Season 5, Carol adopts a pastel sweater and a baking routine and a slightly vacant smile, and immediately begins cataloguing every threat in the community with the systematic efficiency of a military intelligence officer. When a boy named Sam catches her stealing guns from the community armory, she delivers a speech calibrated with such surgical precision to the exact frequency of a child's terror that it stays with him and contributes to his death months later. She describes being tied to a tree outside the walls in the dark and the monsters coming and the screaming that no one will answer. And then she offers him cookies, many cookies, if he says nothing. That combination, existential horror and baked goods, is the most concentrated expression of Carol's character the show ever produces. She orchestrates Alpha's death without ever getting her hands dirty. She frees Negan. She gives him a direction and a purpose, and lets him do what he does. She stands at the border and waits. When Negan sets Alpha's head at her feet, Carol says, "Took you long enough." The show's deepest statement about Carol is in what it never gives her: peace. She does not find rest. She does not arrive somewhere and stop moving. She grieves for every person she has lost. Sophia, Henry, the versions of herself she left behind in those fields and those fires. She told Daryl once when asked if the things she'd done had been worth it, "I don't know. I honestly don't know." And the show never contradicts her. It simply watches her keep going. Chapter 10. Maggie Rhee, The Price of Being Left Behind. Maggie Greene begins the series as a 22-year-old farm girl who has never left her father's land. Her world is defined by faith and family, and the particular comfort of a place that has always been safe. She falls in love with Glenn Rhee during the farm arc, marries him with a ring cut from a walker's finger in a ceremony Herschel performs in a rundown bar, and spends the years that follow building a life inside the ruins, small and precarious and luminous, with the specific joy of people who know exactly how easily it could be taken. Glenn's death is the show's defining wound, not just for Maggie, but for the audience, and for the moral architecture of the story itself. Glenn was the show's conscience. He was the argument, made flesh, that goodness could survive if you protected it fiercely enough. He never lost his compassion. He never stopped seeing the humanity in people. He ran into danger for others routinely and without calculation. And Negan murdered him in a clearing while his pregnant wife watched, and the show never let anyone forget it. Because it was not meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be carried. What Maggie becomes in the years after Glenn's death is harder, and colder, and more dangerous than what she had been. She rises to lead the Hilltop colony efficiently and without sentimentality. She executes enemies who have surrendered when she believes keeping them alive is a liability. She refuses mercy where Rick offers it. When Rick spares Negan's life in the Season 8 finale, cutting his throat and then screaming for a doctor. Maggie is furious. She had planned it differently. She had imagined an ending that felt like justice. What Rick chose felt like politics. She is not wrong. She is just not the person making the decision, and that powerlessness burns in her for years. In Dead City, the spin-off set in a Walker-overrun Manhattan, Maggie's transformation completes itself in the most painful possible way. She is working alongside the man who murdered her husband, and she is good at working alongside him, which is itself a kind of horror. She is pragmatic about Negan in a way that early Maggie would have found unrecognisable. She trades him to the Dharma, a Manhattan power broker, to secure her son, Herschel Jr.'s return, betraying a man she'd come to depend on for a child she has arguably already lost to the circumstances of their life. Herschel Jr. tells her, with the flat and devastating honesty of a teenager who's been through too much too young, that he does not feel safe with her, that she puts her obsession ahead of him, that the person she has become is not someone he knows how to trust. This is the deepest wound The Walking Dead inflicts on its leaders. The moment when the person you spent everything protecting looks at you and sees the monster you became, while you were busy protecting them. Maggie has no answer for it. The show does not give her one. It simply watches her walk forward into the next city, carrying everything she cannot put down. Chapter 11. Ezekiel, the performance that became real. Khary Payton's king. Ezekiel is, in many ways, The Walking Dead's most honest meditation on what leadership actually is and where it comes from. His real name was Ezekiel Sutton. Before the apocalypse, he was two things simultaneously: a zookeeper at a mid-sized Georgia zoo and a community theatre actor who had played kings on small stages. Arthur, Macbeth, Martin Luther King Jr., in local productions that drew small, warm audiences and meant the world to everyone involved. He was a man who understood performance not as deception, but as a gift, a way of giving people something to believe in. When the outbreak began, he returned to the zoo. He found Shiva, a Bengal tiger he had once saved by jumping into her enclosure when she was injured. A moment of completely irrational, self-endangering kindness that she had apparently understood. She had never shown him a tooth since. When survivors saw a man walking the ruins with a tiger padding beside him, they decided he was extraordinary. And Ezekiel, student of what people need, practitioner of what makes them believe, understood exactly what they were deciding and leaned into it. He built the kingdom. He gave himself the language and bearing of royalty. He was, in his own words, the king they needed. When Carol sees through the performance almost immediately, as Carol always does, Ezekiel drops it entirely and tells her the whole story without embarrassment. He was a zookeeper. He liked community theatre. People needed a king, so he became one. If you're asked to be the hero, be the hero. Carol stares at him, and then slowly she starts smiling. Shiva's death in season 8 is Ezekiel's defining catastrophe. Nearly his entire army is gunned down by Saviour heavy weapons outside a satellite outpost, their bodies falling around him like a curtain closing. Captured, injured, dragged toward the sanctuary on a leash, he is taunted by a young saviour who tells him, "Take away the tiger. What's left? Just some meaningless conman in a costume." Jerry bisects the saviour with an axe. But as the three of them are overwhelmed by walkers in a flooded culvert, Shiva launches herself into the horde to save Ezekiel. He watches her die screaming her name, unable to reach her, unable to do anything except witness it. Afterwards, sitting in the rubble of the kingdom, Ezekiel says to Jerry quietly and completely, "I ain't no king, I'm just some guy." Jerry says, "Dude, yes you do." In response to Ezekiel saying Jerry doesn't have to call him Your Majesty anymore. The comedy of the exchange doesn't diminish its weight. Jerry is telling his king, gently and without ceremony, that the performance had been real all along, that the belief it generated was real, that the kingdom was real, even if its founding was theatrical. Ezekiel loses Henry to Alpha's pikes. He loses the kingdom to the Whisperers. He and Carol, who had been building something careful and full of hope between them across seasons, drift apart in the weight of shared grief they can't find a way to carry together. He survives a cancer diagnosis in season 9 with characteristic stubbornness. And at the series finale, he is elected as Governor of the Commonwealth. Not through force, not through terror, but through the consent of the people who needed someone to believe in and decided to believe in him. The theatrical king became a democratic leader. The performance, held long enough and honestly enough, became real. That is The Walking Dead's most gentle argument. Chapter 12. Pamela Milton and the World That Wouldn't Change. Layla Robbins' Pamela Milton is the franchise's final villain, and in many ways its most frightening. Not because of what she personally did, though what she did was monstrous, but because of what she represents. She is not a man with a bat or a woman with a knife or a general with a tank. She is a system. She's what happens when human beings finally get civilization back and discover they have rebuilt it exactly as it was. The Commonwealth in seasons 10 through 11 is the Walking Dead universe's most impressive achievement. Over 50,000 survivors living behind enormous walls in a fully functioning city. Electricity, running water, hospitals, schools, restaurants, a functioning economy with its own currency, professional sports, regular concerts, children who had never known anything other than the apocalypse going to class in the morning. It is everything Rick Grimes and all the people who came before and after him spent their lives working toward. And at the top of it sits Pamela Milton, daughter of a former president, head of a political dynasty described explicitly as the Kennedys or the Bushes, a woman of absolute self-possession who had decided, apparently without much reflection, to rebuild the world she remembered. Not just civilization generally, the specific civilization she had benefited from, with its same hierarchies, its same class structures, its same understanding of who deserved what and why. Your role in the Commonwealth was determined by your role before the apocalypse. Former lawyers got authority. Former bakers stayed in the bakery. People who arrived with nothing were interviewed, assessed, and assigned to the tier the gatekeepers decided they belonged in. The show does not describe this as neutral or inevitable. It describes it as violence dressed in procedure. The same institutional cruelty that had always existed, now operating in a context where there were literally no other options if you wanted to eat. Pamela's son Sebastian runs an extortion scheme using Commonwealth resources that results in the deaths of at least 67 people on suicide runs into walker-infested locations. His exposure triggers the community's political crisis. His death, unbitten by a walker, in a circumstance Eugene Porter had a hand in creating, causes Pamela to activate every authoritarian instinct she has, show trials, mass arrests. And in the series finale, as a massive walker herd breaches the outer walls, an explicit order to her soldiers to defend only the wealthy residential estates district, and to shoot civilians attempting to climb the walls to safety. She was prepared to let thousands of her own people die to maintain control of the situation. This is the end point of every leadership arc the show has followed. This is what the Governor's fish tanks, and Negan's iron and Alpha's pikes, and Rick's throat biting were always building toward. The moment when the sovereign sacrifices the people in order to save the system that gives the sovereign power. Pamela Milton is not a monster. She is the logical conclusion of an idea. General Mercer arrests her. When she attempts to let a walker bite her rather than face imprisonment, Maggie shoots the walker. Because prison for Pamela is the one fate worse than death. She is alive. She is powerless. She will spend the rest of her days in a world she tried to own and failed to hold. 1 year later, Ezekiel, the community theatre actor, the zookeeper, the man who played kings until the playing became real, is elected as governor. The circle closes gently. It is the show's most careful statement of hope. Chapter 13. The line and who decides where it is. We have spent this video walking through these leaders: Shane, Rick the governor, Negan, Alpha, Carol, Maggie, Ezekiel, Pamela. Watching the same pattern repeat across seasons and spin-offs, and different corners of the same shattered world. The rise, the test, the compromise, the justification, the second compromise. The line crossed and redrawn and crossed again until it disappears entirely. It's worth asking, in the quiet of this final chapter, whether the pattern is inevitable, whether The Walking Dead is making a fatalist argument. Corruption always wins, the good are always consumed, the monster always inherits the earth. Or whether it's doing something more careful, whether it's a map of specific conditions under which corruption becomes possible, conditions that can, with enormous effort, sometimes be resisted. The show offers us, across its run, 3 kinds of answers to that question. The first is community. Every leader who avoided complete moral collapse, or who fell and found their way back, had people around them who were willing to challenge them. Michonne knocked Rick unconscious in a street and sat with him while he came back to himself. Daryl told Rick, at various low points in his quiet way, that he was not the person they needed. Carl wrote a letter from his deathbed asking his father to choose mercy one more time. Every leader who fell completely did so in isolation, or by systematically eliminating the people who might have asked the difficult questions. The governor killed Milton, his only advisor willing to say something true. Negan's entire power structure was designed to prevent genuine challenge. Alpha had built a philosophy in which questioning the leader was definitionally weakness, and weakness was death. You cannot course correct without someone willing to stand in front of you and say you've gone wrong. And the first thing power does when it begins to corrupt is eliminate the people most likely to say it. The second is what the show does with grief. It is consistent on one point across its entire run. Unprocessed grief is the single most reliable catalyst for moral collapse. Shane could not survive believing Laurie was gone. The governor could not survive losing Penny. Negan could not survive Lucille. Carol has spent 12 seasons on the edge of an abyss that opened the day they walked Sophia's walker out of a Georgia barn. Maggie carries Glenn's death in every room she enters. The leaders who maintain their humanity were not the ones who did not experience loss. Everyone in this story loses everything. They were the ones who were held through the loss by other people, who were not allowed to grieve alone, who found that the weight could be distributed if you let it be. The ones who collapsed were the ones who took the grief into a private room and locked the door. The third answer is the one the show lands on in its finale, the one it had been building towards since season 1, and states plainly in Daryl's last conversation before he rides away from everything he knows. It is choice, not grand dramatic choice, not the single heroic decision that defines a life, small choice, daily choice, the decision made again and again, in small rooms and dark fields and impossible moments, to not become the thing you are fighting. Rick said, "We are the walking dead." Daryl said, 9 seasons later, "We ain't them." The distance between those two statements is the entire moral project of this universe. Herschel Green said it best. Before the blade and the field and the morning light, before the governor's quiet, terrible liar, Herschel sat in the prison yard and said this: "You step outside, you risk your life. You take a drink of water, you risk your life. And nowadays you breathe and you risk your life. Every moment now you don't have a choice. The only thing you can choose is what you're risking it for." Every leader in The Walking Dead chose what they were risking it for. Shane risked it for a family that wasn't his to claim. The governor risked it for a daughter who was already gone. Negan risked it for a woman he had loved badly and lost. Alpha risked it for a philosophy that required her to abandon the one person she loved most. Pamela risked it for a world that had already proved it wasn't worth saving, unchanged. And Rick risked it. At cost, imperfectly, losing more than any of them, for the idea that it was still possible to be good, that it was still worth trying, that some version of the world Herschel had believed in his stubborn and luminous way, might be worth bleeding for. The show's final image is not triumph. It is not peace. It is Judith writing in a journal on a quiet afternoon in Alexandria, recording what happened so no one will forget. It is Daryl riding toward the horizon, going somewhere new, carrying all of it with him. It is Carol in a greenhouse, her hands in the dirt, not quite at rest but closer to it than she has ever been. The Walking Dead never argues that corruption is inevitable. It argues something more difficult, that resistance to corruption is possible, but extraordinarily expensive, and that the price is paid not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones, across years and seasons and losses that do not stop coming. The fingernails, holding on, for as long as you possibly can. That is the story Robert Kirkman started in 2003, and the television writers carried for 11 seasons, and the spin-offs are still carrying now, in Manhattan and Paris, and wherever Daryl Dixon is riding tonight. Not a story about zombies, never a story about zombies, a story about us. Thanks for spending this time with the law. If this video helped you drift off somewhere quieter and warmer, That is exactly what it was designed for. There is more where this came from. More theories, more deep dives, more slow, careful walks through the worlds that keep us up at night and help us sometimes to sleep. Sleep well. The watch is over for tonight.